Hello, everybody. Welcome to the first ever episode of the Genesis of Dialogue podcast, The Art of Dystopia Novel. My name is Billy, the host of our today's podcast, and by my side is my co-host, Quan.
Hello, everyone. Joining us today is our special guest, Ms. Kirsten. She is a Canadian OSSLT certified teacher.
Today, we'll be talking about the prevalent theme, freedom of religion, within the book The Chrysalids, written by John Whittam, the ambiguous set of issue within today's society, including discrimination, fear of the unknown, and religious evolution.
Firstly, to start off the podcast, Billy, what are your perceptions of the topic of freedom of religions around the world and its place in Vietnam?
Well, within the era of the 21st century, for me personally saying freedom of religion is understood to be one of the fundamental human rights. Vietnam positioned itself as one of the countries to encourage the practice of religion, as the country constitution ensures individual right to freedom and belief in religion. However, freedom of religion is still having to endure a negative impact within our society today worldwide, since there are a certain number of governments around the world that restrain and violate the practice of religion. The most prominent case is observed within Burma, where the majority of the population is Buddhist. Minority population that adhere to the other faiths, such as Christianity, Islam, are instantly denied building permits and pressured to convert to the major faith.
I can clearly see Burma's religious restrictions indicated clear connections to the novel The Chrysalids. This is because during the time of crisis and tragedy, both places were established on a principle of isolations and repressions, in which individuals close themselves off to only one religious custom that they assume will provide more protections and survival strategies. This causes people to have restricted access to knowledge and be unwilling to interact with a larger community.
Yeah, according to Ms. Kirsten, the variation of ethnicity and religions can sometimes be associated with the common distress, especially when society is confined within an isolated state. People tend to segregate themselves at a time of crisis, as they believe their ways of living is one of the most important and the only way for them to survive. This could be seen from the quote of the inspector within the Chrysalids, page 55. Well, every part of the definition is important as any other, and if a child does not come within it, then it is not human. Only God produces perfection. John Whittam, the author, drew a connection between the major theme freedom of religion and fear of the unknown from a perception of an isolated society and its imbalance between the people's knowledge and the people's emotion. When discovering that David has been concealing Sophie's deviance of having an extra toll, he informs David that anyone who does not fulfill the true image lacks a soul and is hence inhuman. The statement reflects a strong sense of bigotry and prejudice thought process within the Wakanook society, as the inspector plainly associate the idea of perfection with God and the norm.
I agree. On the other hand, from a contextual outlook, Wakanookian society is also illustrated as an isolated state of religious and deviant segregations because of the limitations of access to a larger majority. This preceded people of Wakanook to a rather alert state instead of confused, in which people relied on their emotions and not on knowledge.
That's exactly right, because they're so afraid to change and embrace differences. All can be traced back to their fear of what will happen when they actually do so. Therefore, the author successfully demonstrates the persecution of freedom of religion throughout the narrative, as the Wakanookians are strained into fearing and following a singular religion's commandments and go to any extreme to keep themselves pure from deviation.
Moving on, connecting from the first issue of the fear of the unknown, I wanted to talk about the issues of discriminations against different religious practice in the novel.
Freedom of religion can sometimes foster a discriminatory mindset, I can tell you that. In Wakanook, due to the fear of the unknown and the limited information of the outside world, the people of Wakanook always has a stamp on any changes. They close their way and keep their type fixed because they've got the arrogance to think themselves perfect.
Well, I think looking at society, like colonization was really developed on the basis of religion. When you look at the impacts and the beliefs of colonization, even just through First Nations people in Canada, the way that they justified doing such terrible things is because they believed in the church, and they believed that the religion that they practiced was the right way and the only way to do things.
According to Ms. Kirsten, the historical roots of religious discriminations and systematic racism can be directly stemmed from one's desire for a superior positions over another and the continuous lack of knowledge and xenophobic traditions among society. For instance, the history of discriminations within ethnicity and religion is instigated from the base of colonizations. A big part of this social immorality in history was prompted by religious obsessions and self-centered practices.
This is an excellent connection to the novel's continual depiction of the power struggle of religions and races for superiority over one another. So, for me, to quote the book, The Sealand Women, page 156, once said, "We do know that we can make a better world than the old people did. They were only indigenous half-humans, little better than savages. The Sealand Women, despite Wakano's constant proclamation of having a superior attachment to their religious practice, the Sealand Women also likewise believe in the supremacy of her communication method. Her condemnation of the non-telepaths, whom she called primitive, animal, and inferior species, prompted an act of cruelty in killing an entire battlefield of people. Not only is she intolerant of just the non-telepaths, in the present setting, she believed that her kind, the telepaths, can make a better world than the old people because they were only indigenous, half-humans, little better than savages."
An interesting connection, Billy. Since the book is written in 1955 amidst the Cold War, John Wyndham's intentional depictions of the similar negative principles that both Joseph Storm and the Sealand Women hold demonstrate the current situations that the author is living in which a continuous competition to decide who gets the superior and the inferior role was carried out by the US and the USSR.
I agree, that's a great historical connection. So we're going to be moving on to the third theme, religious evolution.
So I think that this whole idea of our society, or Western society, is mainly developed based on this religion, and that is starting to change now, but I think it widely stayed fairly consistent throughout until people started to kind of revolt against it and take the pieces of religion that are really detrimental to certain populations, especially like the advancement of women and what their role should be was widely based on religion, and LGBTQIA plus rights also were widely based on religion, and so I think those are definitely starting to change.
What I can get from Ms. Kirsten's perspective toward freedom of religion is that the idea of religion constantly developing throughout human history and serving as human comforts in times of need. As Ms. Kirsten said, the notions of an individual religious beliefs evolves depending on the context of time and place. People in times of crisis are isolated from the rest of the society, thus they are constitute a xenophobic sense of interacting a typical subjects. In contrast, people now live in a globalized world where they can share and observe different views, in which draws a big difference between modern and past beliefs.
So also to quote the book from just what you just said on page 125, the essential quality of life is living. The essential quality of living is change. Change is evolution, and we're a part of it. When looking at the two distinctive periods, past and present, John Wyndham has shown a strong comparable transformation between the Zealand community and the Wakano community in the novel The Chrysalids. While the Zealand is a society that is more adaptive to changes and is more willing to concede modern revision in terms of religion, Wakanook is a place where I think any subtle differences or changes can cause conflict among civilians and lead to cruel acts.
For instance, the Sealand Women states on page 116 that life is changing, that is how it differs from the rocks. Change is its very nature, who then were the recent lords of creations, that they should expect remain unchanged. By exhibiting the quote above, we can see that the Sealanders have the general acknowledgement of change and improvement As they state, life over time would gradually adjust its branch and its form to become more superb version of itself. Lastly, to end the podcast, I just wanted to recap an essential lesson that we can associate from the topic of freedom of religion to the book, The Chrysalid, and our society. From reading the book, we understand that freedom of religion is an important constituent of any civilizations under a distinct spiritual discipline. Overall, these lessons are critical foundations for a developing community and should be acknowledged to be a greater extent in our culture.
Thank you very much. So that also concludes our first ever episode of the podcast. Thank you so much for listening. Thank you, Miss Kirsten. And I hope you have learned some wonderful lessons within our today's podcast. Stay tuned for the next episodes coming up very soon.